There are things I am legally prohibited from discussing. I want to be transparent about that before I say anything else, because the document I signed in the conference room of a federal building in Boise, Idaho on March 9th, 2019 was not ambiguous about its terms. Non-disclosure, non-disparagement, a prohibition on contact with any media organization, research institution, or academic body regarding the events of February 28th through March 1st, 2019. A prohibition on discussing the subject of the agreement in any public forum. A specific clause about the internet that my attorney said was almost certainly unenforceable, but that the government had included anyway, because when you are trying to contain something, you cover every exit you can identify. I signed it because at that point I had been awake for 51 hours. My property had been partially demolished. I had been separated from the person I had spent 18 months raising and loving and protecting with everything I had. And the alternative to signing was, as the agent across the table from me described it in the flat, clinical language of a man reading from a script. An escalated legal process that would be substantially more difficult for you and your family. I have a daughter. She is 24. She was not present for what happened on the night of February 28th, 2019, and I made choices afterwards specifically designed to keep her clear of the legal and institutional consequences of my choices. The document I signed was partly in service of keeping her clear. I signed it for her. I am telling you this story now because there is a difference between a legal prohibition and a moral one. Because what was taken from my property on March 1st, 2019, in a white government vehicle with no visible markings, was a living being with emotional responses and developmental patterns and an intelligence that I had watched grow across 18 months in the way a parent watches a child grow, because I have spent 5 years in a silence that is eating me alive, and because the alternative, continuing to be silent, allowing what I know to remain contained in a document in a government filing system where it will never be seen, is a choice I am no longer willing to make. I am violating the terms of my NDA. I am aware of this. I have spoken with my attorney, and she has told me that the consequences could range from significant to severe. I am telling this story anyway, because what most people don't understand is that some information is too important to contain, and some experiences are too significant to let die in a drawer. I raised a young Bigfoot. I raised it for 18 months. I documented its development with the care and attention of a scientist and the love of a parent. And then the government found out. And what they did on the night of February 28th, 2019 is something that I will spend the rest of my life trying to make sense of. I was on my property, 46 acres, in the Payette National Forest Corridor in Valley County, Idaho, roughly 8 miles from the nearest town of any size and accessible by a single unpaved road that becomes impassable in significant snow. I had lived there for 11 years at that point, since my divorce, alone with the land and the forest that surrounded it and a border collie named Mac, who had been my primary company for most of that decade. I had gone out after dark because Mac was making noise at the south tree line, not his usual deer-spotted bark, but something lower and more sustained, something that told me he had found something and wasn't sure what to do about it. Mac was a calm and sensible dog. When Mac didn't know what to do about something, I took that seriously. I went to the south tree line with a flashlight and found Max standing at the base of a large ponderosa, pointed, rigid, with the intensity of a dog that has located something and is waiting for instruction. The flashlight found what he had located approximately 8 feet up the tree, in the fork where the lowest major branch split from the trunk. A juvenile Bigfoot, clinging to the tree fork with both hands and both feet in the manner of a young primate holding to a high point of safety, its face turned toward the flashlight beam with eyes that caught the light and reflected it back with the specific luminous quality I would come to know very well across the following 18 months. Eyes that were large and dark and filled, in that first moment, with the expression that I have never found a better word for than terrified. It was approximately 4 feet tall. Its hair was lighter than the adult specimens described in most accounts, a warm chestnut brown, fine in texture, covering everything except the face and the palms of the hands. The hands were the first thing I really registered, because the hands were wrapped around the branch with a grip that even at that height communicated both the physical power of what was holding on and the fear that was driving the holding. The fingers were long, the grip absolute, the knuckles pale with pressure. There was no adult present. I swept the flashlight in every direction, held it in each direction long enough to be sure. The tree line was quiet. Not the intentional quiet I would later come to recognize as the precursor to something significant, but the ordinary quiet of a night in August in the Idaho forest, when the thing that was making it not quiet has moved on. Whatever had been with this creature was gone. This creature was alone, up a tree, in the dark, in the grip of a fear so complete that it had not moved in the full beam of a stranger's flashlight. Max sat down. This was the detail that decided me more than anything else. Max sat down and looked at the creature in the tree, and then looked at me in the way that border collies communicate with the humans they work with. A look that said, "Your call, but I don't think this is dangerous." I sat down at the base of the tree. I turned the flashlight off, and I waited. It took him 3 hours to come down from that tree. 3 hours in the dark at the base of a ponderosa in August heat, with Max settled beside me and the creature above us shifting occasionally in the fork, visible only as a dark shape against the lighter dark of the sky, when the moon came out from behind the cloud cover. 3 hours of the patient waiting that I had learned in 11 years of living alone in a place where patience was not a virtue, but a survival skill. He came down at approximately 12:50 a.m. on August 15th, 2017. Not all at once, in stages, down the trunk, pausing at each stage to assess, looking at me each time with those reflective eyes. When he reached the lowest branch, perhaps 5 feet off the ground, he stopped and sat, and we looked at each other for perhaps 10 minutes. Then he dropped to the ground and stood 8 feet from me and continued looking. I did not move. I did not reach toward him. I spoke quietly, the same low, continuous vocalization that works with frightened horses, with injured wildlife, with any creature whose fear you're trying to address without triggering further fear. It's all right. I'm not going to hurt you. It's all right. After another 10 minutes of this, he sat down in the manner of a small child, sitting cross-legged, back straight, watching me with that expression I was still learning to read. I opened the water bottle in my jacket pocket and drank from it. He watched the motion of drinking with focused attention. I held the bottle out toward him, not far, just an extension of intent. He looked at the bottle for a long time. Then he reached out, and the reach was tentative, careful, so different from the grip strength I had seen in those knuckles on the branch, and took it. He drank from it with a direct competence that told me he understood what it was for, not guessing, not exploring, but using. He drank half the bottle and handed it back to me. He handed it back. He did not drop it, did not throw it, did not hold it as a possession. He extended it back toward me with the specific social gesture of a being that understood giving and returning as a relational act. He was 4 feet tall and alone, and probably 8 or 10 years old by whatever developmental timeline his species followed, and he had handed me back my water bottle in the dark in August in Idaho, and I had, in that moment, no meaningful choice about what was going to happen next. I took the water bottle. I stood up slowly. I said, "Come on then." And I walked back to the house. He followed. Here's why this changed everything for me in ways I did not anticipate and could not have prepared for. The speed of the attachment. Not my attachment to him. That was rapid and perhaps predictable in a man who had been living alone for 11 years and who had, in some deep and unexamined part of himself, been waiting for something to care for. But his attachment to me, which was not the generic dependency of a young animal on a food source, but something considerably more specific and more affecting. The attachment of a being that had lost something and had chosen, with evident intentionality, to attach itself to the first safe thing it could find. He understood very quickly, within the first week, that the house was the inside and the forest was the outside, and that the transition between them was a thing that needed to be managed with care. He did not wander out during daylight. He did not make sounds that would carry to the road when vehicles passed. These behaviors appeared too quickly to be learned through correction. I never had to correct him, never had to indicate that daylight exposure was problematic. He had arrived at these restrictions on his own, through whatever reasoning process a creature of his intelligence applied to a novel situation. My observations consistently showed, in those first weeks, a pattern of observation and imitation that went well beyond anything I had a framework for. He watched me make coffee, and within 3 days was participating in the process, not making coffee, but handling the filter, the carafe, moving things in the sequence he had observed me moving them, in the manner of a child who insists on helping with tasks they cannot yet fully perform, because the participation itself is what matters. He watched me read and sat beside me while I read, with his own form of attention, not looking at the book, looking at me, looking at the book, studying the act of reading as a behavior of an intelligence he was attempting to understand. I gave him a name. This happened on September 2nd, 2017, 19 days after I found him, in the specific way that names happen in close relationships. Not decided, but arrived at. I called him Scout. It suited him in the way names suit the people they belong to when those people are present in the choosing. It was both a description and a hope. I built him a sanctuary. The east side of my property has a large outbuilding, originally a machine shop, 40 by 60 feet, insulated, with no windows and a single heavy door. I converted it over the course of October and November 2017. Deep bedding in one corner, a light source on a rheostat so he could control the illumination level, a water supply, a feeding station, ventilation that was sufficient without creating sound, that would carry outside. I spent approximately $8,000 on these modifications. I paid for everything in cash. I told no one what I was doing or why. Scout grew, not at the rate of a human child, as faster in some dimensions, different in others, but with the unmistakable quality of development that a parent recognizes, because it is the accumulation of small daily changes that suddenly resolve into a new capacity, a new understanding, a new level of engagement with the world. By December 2017, he was communicating with me through a system that was not language in any formal sense, but was unambiguously communication. Consistent vocalizations for specific meanings, a gesture vocabulary that we had developed jointly through the organic process of two beings spending most of their waking hours together trying to understand each other, and a capacity for emotional expression that was, and this is the claim I anticipate being most challenged on, and which I have the most extensive journal documentation for, fully comparable in range and nuance to human emotional expression. He experienced joy, the specific whole-body joy of a creature whose capacity for delight is not yet bounded by the socialization processes that teach human beings to express delight at measured, culturally appropriate levels. When the first snow came in November 2017, I opened the back door at 2 in the morning and led him out into the yard. And what I watched for the following 40 minutes, Scout encountering snow for the first time, or at least for the first time in whatever he remembered, was the most purely joyful thing I have witnessed in my life. The way it looked at things wasn't merely animalistic. It was like watching a child open presents on a morning that had been described to them all year. He experienced fear, specifically and consistently in response to engine sounds. Any engine, but especially the larger sound profiles of trucks and diesel vehicles, which would produce in him a withdrawal response so immediate and so complete that the only word for it is hiding. Not the crouching of an animal in cover. The deliberate, systematic self-concealment of a being that understood that concealment from a specific threat required specific effort. He would be in the middle of something, eating, playing with Mac, engaged in whatever activity had his attention, and a truck would come down the access road half a mile away, and he would be in the machine shop with the door closed before the sound was loud enough for me to locate its direction. This response was not trained. It arrived with him. It was, I believe, learned before August 14th, 2017, in circumstances I can only imagine. He experienced grief. This is the hardest thing to describe because describing it requires me to characterize the emotional state of a being in terms that will inevitably sound like anthropomorphic projection to people who have not watched the thing I watched. I watched Scout grieve. It was not my projection. It was a behavioral pattern, recurring, specific, consistent across multiple instances, that occurred on nights when the forest outside the property was particularly active, when sounds came from the tree line that I learned to identify as the vocalizations of others of his kind passing through the corridor, when something in his external world activated an awareness of what was absent from his immediate world. He would withdraw on those nights. He would not eat. He would sit in a specific corner of the machine shop with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up, and he would make a sound, low, continuous, sustained, that was not a distress call and not a response call, and that my journals describe consistently as mourning. I knew what he was mourning. I had 11 years of experience mourning things in exactly that way, in the specific, private corner of a specific room, with my back against something solid, making whatever internal sound the grief required. I recognized it without needing to understand its precise content. My experience revealed something profound about secrecy. There is no such thing as a perfect secret in the age of remote sensing. I thought I had covered every exposure. I thought the cash purchases, the doctored utility bills, the specific choice of a property with no line of sight from the road to the outbuilding, the fact that I had told exactly 0 people about Scout in 18 months. I thought these precautions were sufficient. I was wrong in a way I did not discover until the discovery had already happened. In January 2019, I applied for a permit to expand the outbuilding. Scout had grown significantly since August 2017. He was, by January 2019, approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall and showing no signs of having reached the end of his growth trajectory. The machine shop that had been more than adequate in the fall of 2017 was becoming cramped, and I had been planning the expansion for months, and I applied for the permit through the county building department the way you do when you want to add on to a structure legally, because I was not aware that my application would trigger anything beyond the standard county permitting process. It triggered a satellite image review. The county, when it processes permits for outbuildings in the National Forest Corridor, sends the permit application to the Forest Service for review of any potential impact on adjacent public land. The Forest Service review in January 2019 included comparison of current satellite imagery against historical satellite imagery. And somewhere in that comparison, in the delta between what my property looked like in August 2016 and what it looked like in January 2019, something showed up that was not the outbuilding expansion I had described in my permit application. I do not know exactly what they saw. I have speculated. The most likely candidate is a thermal signature. Modern satellite platforms routinely collect thermal imaging data, and a large warm body in an insulated outbuilding on a 46-acre property in Valley County, Idaho, would have produced a thermal signature inconsistent with anything the outbuilding's stated purpose should have contained. It is also possible that motion detection analysis of sequential imagery captured Scout's movements in the yard at night on one of the occasions when I had misjudged the cloud cover and my confidence in the darkness. I do not know which. What I know is that something in the satellite comparison flagged my property for a level of attention that a standard permit review does not generate. I know this because of what arrived 4 weeks later. I know the time because I was awake. I have always kept late hours, and Scout's schedule, which was primarily nocturnal, had migrated my own sleep patterns toward the night over 18 months. I was in the main house, reading. Mac was asleep near the wood stove. Scout was in the machine shop. The first indication was Mac, not barking, standing, stiff, facing the front door with the specific body language of a dog that is processing information from its environment and has classified that information as serious. I moved to the window. The access road was dark. The property was dark. And then the darkness resolved as my eyes adjusted and the cloud cover thinned into shapes, multiple shapes. At the property boundary, the specific shapes of people standing in organized positions, which is not a shape that the natural environment produces. I counted 6. perimeter positions at the property boundary evenly spaced facing inward. Not law enforcement in the sense of local police or county sheriff, I would have recognized those configurations. Something that looked more like a tactical deployment by people who had been trained for exactly this kind of operation and who had arrived at this property with a specific objective and a specific plan for achieving it. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because the feelings matter to what happened next. I felt fear, immediate, physical, the kind of fear that activates the same systems as physical danger. But underneath the fear was something else, something that had been building since January when I filed the permit application and that I had been suppressing because the alternative to suppressing it was to act on it. And acting on it would have meant doing something I was not prepared to do. Underneath the fear was the knowledge that this moment had been coming, that the secret, which I had maintained for 18 months with every tool and discipline available to me, had reached the end of its maintainability. My first thought was scout, not myself, scout. I went out the back door, not running, moving quickly and quietly to the machine shop where I used the signal we had developed. 3 specific knocks on the door in a rhythm he recognized, to tell him I was coming in, that this was me, that he should not be alarmed by my entry. I opened the door. He was already in his hiding corner. The engine sounds, 6 vehicles, I would count them later, having approached along the access road with their lights off, had reached him before they reached me. He was in his corner with his knees drawn up and his back against the wall, and his eyes in the dim light were not the eyes of the creature who had come down from the tree in August 2017. They were the eyes of a being that was experiencing the confirmation of something it had been afraid of for a long time. I sat beside him on the floor of the machine shop. I put my hand on his arm. He did not pull away. He made a sound,